The Impossible State. Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament. Wael b. Hallaq. 1. Premises. The paradigmatic case becomes such by suspending and, at the same time, exposing its belonging to the group, so that it is never possible to separate its exemplarity from its singularity. The paradigmatic group is never presupposed by the paradigms. Rather, it is immanent in them. Giorgio Agamben, The Signature of All Things. Humanism is not a science, but religion. Humanists like to think they have a rational view of the world. But their core belief in progress is a superstition, further from the truth about the human animal than any of the world's religions. John Gray, Straw Dogs. In a narcissistic society, the cultural devaluation of the past reflects not only the poverty of the prevailing ideologies, which have lost their grip on reality and abandoned the attempt to master it, but also the poverty of the narcissist's inner life. A society that has made nostalgia a marketable commodity on the cultural exchange repudiates the suggestion that life in the past was in any important way better than life today. Our culture's indifference to the past, which easily shades over into active hostility and rejection, furnishes the most telling proof of that culture's bankruptcy. The prevailing attitude, so cheerful and forward-looking on the surface, derives from a narcissistic impoverishment of the psyche. Christopher Lasch, The Culture of Narcissism. The proposition that a modern Islamic state is impossible and even a contradiction in terms contains at least two hidden questions that must be stated at the outset. First, if this state is inconceivable, then, one might ask, how did Muslims, having in the past commanded a great civilization and built many empires, rule themselves? What form of governance did they practice? And second, with this impossibility in mind, what type of political rule are Muslims presently adopting or likely to adopt in the future? The second part of the latter question, with the predictions it involves, is not integral to our argument and constitutes a separate field of inquiry for another book and decidedly another author. But the question also makes reference to the present. Representing the culmination of nearly 2 centuries worth of history shot through with colonial rule and post-colonial nationalist reaction and continuity. Elsewhere, I have suggested that the post-colonial nationalist elites maintain the structures of power they had inherited from the colonial experience and that, as a rule and after gaining so-called independence for their countries, they often aggressively pursued the very same colonial policies they had fiercely fought against during the colonial period. They inherited from Europe a ready-made nation-state, with its constitutive power structures, for which the existing social formations had not been adequately prepared. The paradigmatic concept of the citizen, without which no state can last, has been slow in coming, and the political lacunae left after the collapse of the traditional structures have not been properly filled. The nation-state thus sits uncomfortably in the Muslim world, as evidenced in the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where the state apparatus has subordinated and disfigured Sharia's norms of governance, leading to the failure of both Islamic governance and the modern state as political projects. Nor have the other Muslim countries fared any better, because the political organization they adopted from and after colonialism has been and remains authoritarian and oppressive, and because their integration of Sharia as a mode of governance has hardly paid anything more than lip service to the original. The failure, in other words, has shown itself at nearly all levels. We are therefore compelled to dismiss the modern experiment in the Muslim world as a massive political and legal failure from which no lessons can be positively learned as to how Muslims may govern themselves properly. Their states have not successfully met any serious challenge, while the Sharia that they often constitutionally enshrine as a or the source of law has proven, as I suggested elsewhere, institutionally dead and politically abused. To take the present-day call for a restored Sharia seriously, we cannot look at present-day legal and political practices as worthy of consideration, as a model or a discursive field that can instruct. The modern state in the Muslim world can hardly inspire, and its so-called Sharia is in shambles. We therefore would do well to overlook the modern Islamic experiment with the Sharia, leaving it entirely out of consideration and focusing instead on what the Sharia meant for Muslims throughout the 12 centuries before the colonialist period, when it existed as a paradigmatic phenomenon. The Sharia practices of the modern states in Islamic countries are simply irrelevant to the arguments of this book and cannot, and thus must not, be invoked as a measure by which pre-modern paradigmatic Sharia is understood, evaluated, or judged. We are therefore left with the first question that we posed above. How did Muslims rule themselves during 12 centuries of pre-colonial history? If it is our argument that a modern Islamic state is impossible, then any such form of governance in pre-modern Islamic history must be deemed never to have existed. It would be a fortiori precluded as a conceptual possibility. This preclusion would rest on the obvious fact, whose implications we will discuss in the next chapter, that the modern state's genealogy is exclusively European. For given the geographic, systemic, and epistemic genealogy of the modern state, then it could not have, ipso facto, been Islamic. But the preclusion is also determined by a non-historical consideration. Namely, that there was a qualitative difference between even pre-modern prototypical states and pre-modern Islamic forms of governance. To see these Islamic forms, as some political scientists have, as belonging to an indistinctly grouped constellation of pre-modern states is not only to engage in uneducated guesses but also to be unaware of the driving paradigmatic forces that gave form and content to what we will henceforth call Islamic governance. The political, legal, and cultural struggles of today's Muslims stem from a certain measure of dissonance between their moral and cultural aspirations, on the one hand, and the moral realities of a modern world, on the other. Realities with which they must live but that were not of their own making. In one sense, the entirety of this book seeks to substantiate this claim. The West, by which I mean here mainly Euro-America, lives somewhat more comfortably in a present that locates itself within a historical process that has been of its own creation. It lives in an age dictated by the terms of the Enlightenment, the industrial and technological revolutions, modern science, nationalism, capitalism, and the American-French constitutional tradition, all of which, and much more, have been organically and internally grown products. The rest of the world has followed or, if not, has felt the pressure to do so. There is in effect no other history but that of Euro-America, not even pre-Enlightenment European history. Minor segments of earlier history may have been rescued or retrieved. E.g. Greek democracy, Aristotle, the Magna Carta, etc. But these remain subservient, if not instrumental, to the imperatives of the modern historical narrative and to the progress of Western civilization. Africa and Asia, in most cases, continue to struggle in order to catch up. In the process not only foregoing the privilege of drawing on their own traditions and historical experiences that shaped who they were and, partly, who they have become, but also letting themselves be drawn into devastating wars, poverty, disease, and the destruction of their natural environment. Modernity, whose hegemonic discourse is determined by the institutions and intellectuals of the powerful modern West, has not offered a fair shake to 2/3 of the world's population, who have lost their history and, with it, their organic ways of existence. But this is not all. Even if we accept, for the sake of argument, the modernists' claim that poverty, disease, and famine have been the lot of humanity since time immemorial, these same advocates of the virtues of the modern project must face 2, possibly 3, counterclaims. The first and least evincive of the 3 is that whereas poverty, famine, and disease were in pre-modernity mostly the work of nature and therefore could not be helped, they are nowadays mostly man-made. Capitalism, industrialism, and the resultant destruction of natural habitat are not the work of nature. They are the effects of so-called progress. The second, a more secure counterclaim, is the modern fragmentation. within a system of state capitalism, of what were once organic and familial social structures. There is no denying that the collapse of the traditional family and community has in part created the disenchanted, fragmented, and narcissistic individual, the subject of commentary by so many a modern thinker, sociologist, psychoanalyst, and philosopher. This collapse is integral to the modern project and is one that defines it in fundamental ways. Third, and most importantly, there can be no question whatsoever of the disastrous effects of the modern project on the natural world we live in, an unprecedented project i.e., in the strongest sense, the ultimate measure of man. Perhaps there is nothing more damning of modern man and woman than this project of destruction. It is a disaster for which we must all be judged, not as a scientifically determined homo economicus or as merely irresponsible consumers but as morally accountable beings. The moral and other implications of this project are quintessentially epistemological. For they bear upon and interrogate our philosophies, sociologies, sciences, technologies, politics, and everything we do. To insist that this project of destruction be evaluated on a moral and ethical basis is to cut, in profound epistemological ways, through politics, economics, law, and much else. None of these substantive counterarguments is inseparable from our Constitution as moral subjects, and all three must, in the final analysis, rest on moral accountability. Therefore, and as we will see in the final chapter, ethical and moral human responsibility cannot, even by Enlightenment standards, and especially by their Islamic counterparts, be abdicated. On account of social injustice, social fragmentation, and the project of destruction, the modernists are left with little choice but to accept that if ethical human agency is to be retained, as the Enlightenment has preached and as the long history of Islam has insisted, then that agency did not, and could not, give rise to these three consequences in the pre-modern world. I say could not, because a proper definition of morality is not simply to treat a person who is unknown to you and whom you are not likely to meet again as you would treat yourself, but, more importantly, it is being unable to commit or refrain from committing an act, not because you intrinsically cannot but because you cannot live with, or cannot allow yourself to face, its consequences. This latter definition, widely neglected, sums up the problematic of the modern project and one that constituted the paradigm of the pre-modern world, including that of Islam. As we shall see in due course, the relegation of the moral imperative to a secondary status and its being largely divorced from science, economics, law, and much else has been at the core of the modern project, leading us to promote or ignore poverty, social disintegration, and the deplorable destruction of the very earth that nourishes humankind, in terms of both material exploitation and value. And let us state the obvious, though it need not be stated, that in this project, the state has been a most significant player. If this much, or any close approximation thereof, is accepted, then we have a good reason to search for moral resources in other traditions, resources that may support us in our social, economic, political, and legal ventures. The search for moral resources in the manner that we shall propose here is certainly not a new proposal but one that has been the constant preoccupation of a number of thinkers, such as Alasdair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and Charles Larmor, to cite only three. However, whereas these thinkers understandably limited themselves to the so-called European tradition, seeking answers to their queries in Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and their like, as if Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism were unfamiliar to pre-modern Muslims and as if Aquinas were not a thoroughgoing student of Averroes and other Muslim philosophers of his kind. We focus our inquiry here on the Muslim moral resources, by virtue of the fact that Muslims possess their own tradition, extensive, rich, and rooted in centuries of cultural achievement. The continuing deep effects of this tradition on modern Muslims lends credence to MacIntyre's critique of the Enlightenment concept of autonomous rationality, where ethical values are assumed to issue from noumenal reason, rational inquiry, and thus ethical values are embedded MacIntyre rightly observes, in a tradition, a conception according to which the standards of rational justification themselves emerge from and are part of a history in which they are vindicated. Accordingly, when all things have been said and done, the thematic similarities between our project and those of Taylor, Larmor, and especially MacIntyre will become patently evident. They may indeed turn out to be too evident. If only because the moral resources that we will unearth in the pre-modern Islamic tradition are not only reflective of shared theoretical and philosophical inquiry, as these three philosophers have undertaken, but also, and more significantly, of a paradigmatic way of living. In other words, while the traditions on which these philosophers have drawn consisted of theoretical and philosophical concepts, and some would say a notion of community that no one has ever lived in, the Islamic tradition on which the project of retrieval can draw is a composite one, combining the theoretical philosophical with sociological, anthropological, legal, political, and economic phenomena that have emerged in Islamic history as paradigmatic beliefs and practices. To speak of this paradigmatic way of living as a full-fledged phenomenon is in effect to speak of paradigmatic Islamic governance. I employ the compound expression Islamic governance in order to draw a qualitative, but not necessarily quantitative, distinction between living life in, under, and with the modern state, on the one hand, and living life in, under, and with pre-modern Sharia, on the other. These two modes of existence had a similar hegemonic range, hence our exclusion of the quantitative. However, they differed from each other dramatically in almost all other respects. In order to speak of these two phenomena in a comparatively meaningful way, we must recognize what stands in them as paradigms, a recognition that can allow us to identify parallel systemic features whose comparison makes for a rationally valid undertaking. But paradigms also serve a more important function, namely, the identification within systems, relations, and conceptual structures of what might be called driving forces, which give systems and structures a particular order of things, to borrow one of Foucault's titles. We shall now therefore elaborate the sense of paradigm, keeping in mind that while such thinkers as Schmitt, Kuhn, and Foucault are for us central in formulating a definition of the concept, our account may at certain points be somewhat different from theirs. A starting point toward a definition of paradigm is Carl Schmitt's notion of central domain. If a domain becomes central, then the problems of other domains are solved in terms of the central domain. They are considered secondary problems, whose solution follows as a matter of course only if the problems of the central domain are solved. In illustration of this notion, Schmitt offers the example of European technical progress during the 19th century, an arena of progress that, to use our term, was paradigmatic. The massive upsurge of technical progress affected all moral, political, social, and economic situations. Its overpowering effect gave it the status of a religion of technical progress which promised that all other problems would be solved by technological progress. It became a religion of technical miracles, human achievements, and the domination of nature. Whereas in an age of traditional religion the central domain is moral upbringing, moral education, and worldly moral desiderata, in the technical age what counts as progress, as a true achievement, is economic and technical progress. Similarly, in an economic age, one needs only solve adequately the problem of the production and distribution of goods in order to make superfluous all moral and social questions. Thus, all concepts, including God, freedom, progress, anthropological conceptions of human nature, the public domain, rationality and rationalization, and finally the concept of nature and culture itself derive their concrete historical content from the situation of the central domains and can only be grasped therefrom. The Enlightenment, highly relevant to our concerns here, provides yet another example of a paradigm. There is no doubt that this project encompassed intellectual and political movements that ranged across a wide spectrum of intellectual difference. Suffice it here to cite the philosophical divergences of, and dramatically opposing Weltanschauungs between and among, Hobbes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, J.S. Mill, and Marx, to mention only a few. It would thus seem impossible to lump them, and many others, together, much less the thought systems and movements they generated, under any single identifiable category. Yet it is eminently arguable that the Enlightenment in its totality, and despite its Kierkegaards and Herders, e.g., exhibits a paradigm, one featuring a shared substrate of assumptions and presuppositions that bestows on it a certain unity, despite its internal multiplicity. As John Gray has aptly argued, the core project of the Enlightenment was the displacement of local, customary, or traditional moralities, and all forms of transcendental faith, by a critical or rational morality, which was projected as the basis of a universal civilization. This new morality, secular and humanist and binding on all human beings, would set universal standards for the assessment of human institutions. Under the command of human reason finally divorced of traditional principles of morality, the project would aim to create a universal civilization. This is the project that animated Marxism and liberalism in all their varieties, which underpins both the new liberalism and new conservatism. And it is this core project i.e. shared by all Enlightenment thinkers, however pessimistic or dystopic they may sometimes be as to its historical prospects. This core project constituted the central domain, one by which all major and central problems were solved and which gave and continues to give direction, for better or worse, to our ways of life. But central domains as paradigms have more to them than Schmidt's account allows for. Calling, after Schmidt's own linguistic usage, the non-central domains peripheral, we must acknowledge a dialectical relationship between the central and peripheral domains. The solutions provided for the latter do not just follow as a matter of course and only if the problems of the central domain are solved. In our account of paradigm, what is involved is a system of knowledge and practice whose constituent domains share in common a particular structure of concepts that qualitatively distinguish them from other systems of the same species. While it is true that the problems in the central domain acquire priority and subordinate the other domains to these priorities, all these domains function within a system of knowledge that shapes the very priorities within the peripheral domains themselves. If I understand Schmidt correctly, his account seems somewhat linear, because his concept of the political required marshalling and single-mindedly subordinating all forces within the modern structures of power in favor of privileging his neo-Hobbesian concept. In our account of paradigm, the peripheral domains are not so much peripheral as subsidiary and supportive, their relegation to this status being not the function of logical or ontological precedence of the central domain but rather the entrenchment and anchoring of this domain within a system constituted no less by the subsidiary domains. The privileging within a culture of a particular domain is therefore a perspectivist act, one that is a function of the culture's placement of a particular value, or set of values, that appears more prominent in that domain than in others. But that value must, perforce, pervade the subsidiary domains, which at once partake in producing and are produced by it. While Schmidt is right in insisting on the central domain as a driving force, our account of paradigm emphasizes the centrality of the values adopted in the central domain as ideal values that remain the distinctive desiderata and the locus of purposive action and thought, even when their application and realization are not always achieved and even when the competing forces within the domains constituting the paradigm undermine such application and realization. For paradigms represent fields of force relations, encompassing opposing and competing discourses and strategies. This is what led Foucault to declare that these discourses of power, in their oppositional trajectories, are inseparable, for discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in a field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. They can, on the contrary, circulate without changing their form from one strategy to another, opposing strategy. If power is to deserve the name it bears, if it were to produce effects over its subjects, then its processes and strategies, in their confluence and opposition, must yield such effects that both directly and obliquely flow from these processes and strategies. The full materialization of these effects amounts to the production of a central domain. Thus, while the supreme values reigning in the central domain might operate against competing and subversive strategies within this domain itself, as well as those within the subsidiary domains, a central domain remains central as long as the balance of force relations allows for those values to dictate the rules of play and relations of power within the system. Equally important, however, is the recognition that within both central and subsidiary domains there always exist subversive discourses and resisting strategies that constantly challenge the paradigmatic discourses. That is, the discourses that constitute, reflect, and advocate the central domain and its values. Our account of paradigm then allows for diversity within unity, for exceptions and violations, and for irregularity and abnormality. But if these are subversive forces, as they are by definition, then they are so precisely because they are not positively determinative of the central domain, although they may negatively be so by virtue of the responses the central domain provides to meet their challenge. However, once any of these forces is able to subvert the existing paradigm, replacing it as the locus of supreme value, then what has now become a former paradigm or former central domain will join the ranks of the subversive forces or just vanish altogether. This paradigm shift finds attestation in nearly all modern phenomena, beginning with the creation of a distinction between fact and value and is and ought, and ending with the modern bureaucratic state, modern capitalism, and nationalism, all of which will directly concern us throughout the book. We can therefore speak not only of a paradigm of the modern state, constituted by a central and subsidiary domains, but also of that of Islamic governance. We shall address the former in the next chapter but must now attend to the latter. The fuller characteristics and implications of the paradigm of Islamic governance will emerge in chapters 3 through 6. But for now we must assert that the defining emblem of this paradigm is the Sharia. The Sharia, as will become clear in due course, represented and was constituted by a moral law, hence its significance for us as a moral resource for the modern project. Equivalent to Aristotle and Aquinas in the Macintyrean proposal, its paradigmatic status for us lies in the very fact of its being a moral system in which law, in the modern sense, was a tool and a technique that was subordinated to and enmeshed in the overarching moral apparatus but was not an end in itself. In the Sharia, the legal is the instrument of the moral, not the other way around. As a central domain, the Sharia was the measure against which the subsidiary domains were judged, and its solutions largely determined the solutions of those domains. In the intellectual spheres, the structure of Muslim education was determined by priorities laid down in the Sharia. Such fields as language, linguistics, hermeneutics, logic, rhetoric, dialectic, and epistemology were created, developed, and refined within the purview of the Sharia domain. Even mathematics and astronomy, which became the foundations of early modern European science, evolved to impressive degrees as responses to Sharia stimuli. In whatever field a scholar or an intellectual ultimately specialized, his or her basic undergraduate training was always Sharia. In its formal discourse, the Sharia generally did not account for problems and solutions in other domains, having, as a rule, assumed them to be subsidiary and requiring solutions as such. These latter domains catered to the demands and priorities of the Sharia and were often designed and organized to serve its needs. In the practical sphere, economic life, however messy, was regulated not only by technical Sharia rules but also by a pervasive Sharia ethic. The economic domain was Sharia-minded because society, the subject, object, and predicate of Sharia, was Sharia. And political governance, while being less organic to the social than the economic domain, was constrained by a culture and society that by and large knew and accepted nothing other than the Sharia and its paradigmatic ethical stature. This is of course not to say that the paradigmatic status of the Sharia ensured an ideal life. As we have emphasized earlier, paradigms or central domains are not only supported by subsidiary domains. Together with the latter domains, they embody exceptions, irregularities, and violations, all of which amount to subversive discourses, often contingent and ephemeral but at times not. The Sharia was no exception, in that it had to live in a society that was, like any other, messy and in constant need of certain forms of order and organization. That society no doubt witnessed the overtaxed peasant, the criminal, the insolvent debtor, and the unhappy and abused wife. Like any society. And without analogizing with the excessively violent, oppressive, and church-abused Europe of the Middle Ages. Muslim society from North Africa and Muslim Spain to Java and Samarkand had its share of misery. It obviously had its own invaders and conquerors, its rebels, larcenists, petty thieves, highway robbers, and even the occasional corrupt judge. But the moral law, as we will see, consistently and unquestionably ruled the day, its paradigmatic discourses and practices persisting in the continual recreation of a particular order. The mess of social reality. The victimized child, the robbed trader, the overtaxed peasant. Could always rely on a hegemonic moral system that did its best to address this reality. That it was not always successful is a fact that we should take for granted. For perfect success is the lot of no society, past or present. But the paradigmatic efficacy of the moral disposition cannot be questioned. The paradigm, like its particular and technical legal rules, always strove toward the realization of this moral end, sometimes failing but most often succeeding, which is precisely what made it a paradigm. The entirety of the system rested on the concept of jihad. Much maligned nowadays because it has become, especially in late modernity, almost exclusively defined by the influential Schmittian idea of the political. The concept dictated, at every turn, the indispensability of striving. The literal meaning of the term jihad. Toward the accomplishment of the moral end. This systemic and profound psychological meaning of jihad will become clearer as the argument of this book unfolds. But for now we must take care to separate the signification of the moral resource we are trying to identify from any accusation of nostalgia, for this is precisely the charge leveled. Unjustly, though expectedly. Against MacIntyre. And to some extent Taylor. To do so, we must address two issues, each represented in a question. First, what components of a now institutionally dead Sharia can be identified with such moral resources? And second, how would such an identification escape the charge of nostalgia? The first question obliges us to define the relationship between the modern Muslim subject and the Sharia, a system that in its day was at once moral, legal, cultural, and deeply psychological. Modern Muslims obviously possess the right and the empowered agency to claim for themselves a secular subjectivity. One that acknowledges Islam as a nominal religious affiliation and without it entailing a particular system of practices and obligations that we will refer to in due course as the technologies of the self. In fact, this project of secularization had already been adopted and tried during the first 3/4 of the 20th century. But the project, to judge by the overwhelming evidence, has proven to be largely unsuccessful, this evidence being, among other phenomena, the failure of Nasserism and socialism and the subsequent rise of Islamism after the 1960s. Islamism is not just about social justice and profound resentment of the political and military practices of the Western countries in the Islamic world. It is a moral movement that, however politicized, offers critiques of social injustice, political corruption, and Western political domination in moral terms. However lacking in philosophical articulation these have so far been. For the Islamists, the moral, to use Schmitt's scheme, is the declared central domain. That latent desideratum providing the core impetus for the overall conception of this book. The problems of all other domains, including the economic and political, are solved in terms of the central domain. They are considered secondary problems, whose solution follows as a matter of course only if the problems of the central domain are solved. In the context of the moral, Schmidt's declaration could just as easily have been uttered verbatim by any Islamist intellectual. This is precisely why the moral resources of paradigmatic Islamic governance, that is, of the paradigm that was Shari-minded and thus morally dictated, become relevant. Just as the modern West drew and continues to draw on its last 5 centuries of experiences and traditions. On its Renaissance, Enlightenment, and liberal thought, Muslims nowadays are challenging this traditional narrative and are increasingly developing their own history as a discursive moral practice, in such a way as to provide a source of their own. This is not to say that any of their major discourses calls for the restoration of the Sharia in its traditional form. In its traditional institutions, practices, and hermeneutical conceptions of life, for all these, as anyone can see, have vanished without hope of return. But it does mean that Muslims still find in their history, just as the West finds in the Enlightenment, a resource on which they can capitalize while facing the challenges of the modern project, a project that has proved incapable of solving even those problems of its own making. Pitting the Sharia against the Enlightenment obviously does not work for every purpose. But as the central domain of the moral, the Sharia is not only a match for the Enlightenment and its resultant moral system but is potentially an immeasurably instructive moral font. While the Sharia is now institutionally defunct, including its hermeneutics, courts, discursive practices, educational systems, and the entire range of its sociology of knowledge, much i.e. psychologically and spiritually latent has survived, hence the preserved memory of it as a moral resource. While Islamic contract law, commercial dealings, penal law, and much else in terms of applied procedural and substantive law have extensively been replaced by Western laws, Western courts, and modern legal practices, the pillars of Islam and their overpowering effects have not. They continue to define what it means to be a Muslim. Therefore, we largely but not exclusively delimit the moral resources in terms of the technologies of the self, and these are provided for amply in the discourses and practices of the pillars. The entire domain of the pillars has been left by the modern state mostly untouched, because it is regarded as belonging to the private sphere. Yet this domain extends well beyond the private sphere, as this book will show in the course of its discussion, especially, and most directly, in Chapter 5. Capitalizing on the technologies of the self thus in no way involves a retrieval of pre-modern Shari institutions, practices, or even education. It is a moral project of the first order, an attempt to draw on the historical self for moral guidance. It is a project of moral critique, moral deliberation, and moral substitution. Which is to say that it is a project that aims to find a moral space for the Muslim subject in the modern world. A subject who has grown no less disenchanted by modernity than his or her Western counterpart. The retrieval of Islamic moral resources is therefore as much a modern project as modernity itself. And as a modern project, it is also postmodern to the core. Postmodernity, let us be clear, both assumes and attempts to transcend modernity, but modernity nonetheless. Many observers, especially those habituated to the Western liberal tradition and its values, will no doubt question this project, charging it, at the very least, with the sin of nostalgia. I think much has been said in the foregoing paragraphs to dispel this notion, at least for those who believe that the liberal project does not have a monopoly on truth. But the doubters remain legion. Their predictable response to the Muslim project of moral retrieval, including those who expound it as a scholarly inquiry, is that this project remains nostalgic, that it has no place in the modern world. Therefore, we must now address this charge, unpacking its conceptual and doctrinal implications. The charge of nostalgia rests on 2 misconceptions. First, our invocation of historical moral capital does not amount to an attempt to restore pre-modern practices and institutions but rather to draw upon a conception of the world that features the virtues and competence of moral instruction. It is not one of attempting to roll back the modern project, as John Gray seems to think of MacIntyre's proposal, but instead of seeking to retrieve the overarching and encompassing values that paradigmatically defined Islam and its ways of life for over a millennium. This becomes all the more urgent in light of the fact that these values continue to provide answers to the environmental, social, and psychological spiritual problems that modernity has created. Problems that will occupy us throughout the present book. Any claim to the effect that we cannot learn from others is one that indulges in self-diminution or narcissistic hubris. For the assumption is that we are either incapable of learning from any source outside of ourselves or are very capable but think that our unsurpassed progress made us superior to all preceding moralities and moral beings. Obviously, the two assumptions are plainly false. Second, the charge of nostalgia is intrinsically baseless because it implicitly presupposes a doctrine that itself cannot withstand scrutiny. That doctrine is modern progress. Whenever and wherever there is a charge of nostalgia, there is a virulent presence of a doctrine of modern progress. Their association is one of entailment, just as the concept of mother logically and ontologically entails the existence of child. Engaging in the discourse of progress, so our argument goes, is an ideological position, one that fixes the rules of discourse in favor of that position, therefore precluding rival views from consideration ab initio. It is not so much an exclusion of history itself from consideration, for history is invoked by everyone at every turn. History is not only in our language but constitutes this language. The ideological position is rather defined by an ab initio preclusion of any claim in history that contravenes the progressivist outlook. An outlook that has found a discursive weapon of defense in the strategic doctrine of progress. There is, as we shall see, a contradiction in this doctrine's conception of history, since it itself arises from a historical Weltanschauung, using history to justify itself, but it simultaneously denies history when history is bestowed with an interpretation that contravenes its own, by an illiberal straitjacketing of history. This doctrine therefore justifies and rationalizes the practices of the present, wearing the latter's supremacist authority to pronounce on anything and everything deemed to stand outside of its parameters. Thus, for instance, the invocation of an ethic in a historical tradition that can instruct in re-evaluating the modern project's indulgence in the destruction of nature is usually dismissed as nostalgic. Since the progressive tools of modernity, materialized in its technical sophistication, are themselves said to possess the capabilities to cure these destructive effects. Modernity, in other words, can always take care of itself on its own terms, and it is in no need of an old sage who can instruct. It can take care of itself on its own terms. Yet, with all its impressive and unprecedented canvas of knowledge and technical sophistication, the destruction of the natural order continues unabated and beyond its control. We always know better, even better than what we ourselves knew just a while ago. The idea of progress rests not on eternal truths but on technical science, whose ultimate reference of truth is itself. We always know better, because science and technicalism have laid the foundations of truth and dictated its rules. Whatever they say, at any point in time, is the truth. A scientific cure for a disease becomes the truth until it is found to cause as much harm as the benefits it was supposed to provide and until another cure, also the result of progress, is invented. The doctrine of progress never asks why the disease exists in the first place. Nor does it ask profound existential and moral questions about the system that produces such ills, about its structures and modes of operation. For once the system in its entirety is questioned, the very science that produces the cures will be, perforce, questioned and ultimately undermined. The doctrine therefore lives in the moment, an uncertain moment whose truth is as ephemeral as the alacrity with which the next truth is introduced. It cannot seek guidance from the past because the past, despite its comparative simplicity, imposes on it the duty to ask the larger questions that it is not equipped to handle. Nor can it guarantee its own truth against the future, which always has the ultimate power of repeal. The doctrine of progress has therefore neither foundation nor reference, except, respectively, in and to itself. It is its own source of authority, and in this way, it is a God. Being rationally autonomous, as we all are supposed to be. This God has determined, through science and reason, that the big questions of the past cannot be given a hearing because they are outmoded and irrelevant to the advances of modern civilization. Modern science, and reason, the latter being of course universal. But the fact of the matter remains that the concerns of the past remain unheard because there is nothing in the doctrine of progress that equips it to contemplate the profound moral questions dominating what is supposed to be the central domain. This incapability is not only intrinsic to the doctrine. It is also the result of the doctrine being itself the consequence of the faltering status of this moral domain. The latter domain, if it is a domain at all, is barely subsidiary. Its problems are identified and their solutions provided only when the problems of the central domain, whatever it may be, are solved, and this latter domain is decidedly not moral. This is precisely why the doctrine of progress refuses to engage these questions by casting them as nostalgia, as attempts to retrieve the tyranny of morality, turning a blind eye to the fact that its own doctrinal position is intellectually no less oppressive. As we have intimated, the doctrine of progress is the brainchild and handmaiden of the modern conception of history, made to encompass all human experience from the beginning of time, whenever that may have been. History was endowed with a new structure by the Enlightenment. Whereas in many cultures history is structured eschatologically, providing a narrative of moral choices intended to instruct. The Enlightenment structure was determined by the essentially liberal universalist postulate that the experiences of countless societies and cultures of the past represent a collective phenomenon, indeed a monolith, driven by a certain intent, or spirit or geist, and directed toward a particular purpose, namely, progressive improvement. This improvement is couched in the interrelated and integrated terms of material advance, scientific knowledge, technical and political development, material enrichment, maturity, in both the Kantian and Comtean senses. And even, as Walter Benjamin has noted, the infinite perfectibility of mankind. Dogmatic and lacking adherence to reality. The theory of progress is founded on the assumption that time has a homogeneous teleological structure, that this structure is inevitable, and that therefore the earliest phases of history were preparatory for the later phases, which were in turn simply the means to reach the intended summit of real human progress. Western modernity. As Adorno observed, this structure of time was not merely a logical requirement for the theory of progress. Rather, it effectively justified and validated the events and developments of the present, because these latter were regarded as predetermined and therefore inevitable. Yet there is another important dimension to this notion of predetermination, namely, that all history, itself intended to prepare for the dawn of modernity, is insufficiently developed and, in Hegelian and Comtean terms, not yet mature. The logical conclusion of this line of thinking is that no culture or civilization outside of and prior to modern Europe possessed the same validity, competence, and moral and intellectual development. Whatever these civilizations had possessed of value, culturally or otherwise, was consumed in the process of preparing for a higher goal, outside and beyond themselves. The only way for them to escape their fate as fodder for the historical march was, and remains, to join true, mature civilization. Pervading what Skeeler has termed the Western thought structure of domination, the idea of progress came, in almost all of its variants, to structure history in specifically Eurocentric ways. Condorcet viewed even setbacks in history as instructive mistakes, so to speak, which Europe, the highest of all civilizations, could learn to avoid. The reader of Condorcet's famous work on the subject is struck by its tenor, by the overall notion that, for Condorcet, despite his deep commitment to so-called Egalite and Fraternite, all societies of the past, irrespective of geography or time, lived and died for the sake of, and in preparation for modern Europe. Meinecke came to a similar conclusion regarding Voltaire, arguing that the governing motives of his historiography were to utilize the whole of world history for the service of the Enlightenment. Hegel predicated individual freedom on his theory of the spirit. Geist. Wars, violence, and the horrors of history are in fact conducive to the improvement and refinement of the Geist. In Hegel's theory, there is something distinctive and superior about the period of modernity, a period for which all previous history has been somehow preparatory. The Enlightenment theory of progress shapes not only history, but also, as we intimated, the very structures of modern language, a language that in turn not only reflects the Weltanschauung of the domination of nature and man but also constitutes and conveys domination itself. There is perhaps no idea or doctrine as powerful in the modern mind as this theory. It has been declared a law of historical development, a philosophy of history, and as a consequence also a political philosophy. No single idea has been more important in Western civilization, it being one of the hardiest of Western ideas or values. In his introduction to Barry's important work on this theory, Charles Beard was able to declare that among the ideas which have held sway in public and private affairs for the last 200 years, none is more significant or likely to exert more influence than the concept of progress. For the past 2 centuries it has stood, and continues to stand, paradigmatically, as the language of the new gods. It acknowledges no principles except its own, which is to say that it spurns any moral and ethical standard that it itself does not fashion. Being a receptacle for ideology, the doctrine of progress creates faithful followers who believe themselves to be absolutely in the right, always finding themselves confronted by others whom they regard as absolutely in the wrong. With the foregoing in mind, we now proceed under the assumption that it is legitimate to invoke any central domain of the moral, from past or present, that may provide us with a resource of moral retrieval. While the past is materially and institutionally defunct, its moral principles are not. Thus invoking the paradigm of Islamic governance is as plausible and legitimate a project as invoking Aristotle, Aquinas, or Kant. It is this invocation that will occupy us in the following chapters.